So welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be joined by an esteemed environmental scientist, Chris Mitchell, who will share with us his valuable insight in the area of sustainable development and climate change. Welcome, Chris. Thank you very much for uh, coming and talking to us today.
Thank you. A pleasure to meet everyone virtually.
Excellent. So Chris is really well equipped to offer a unique real-world perspective on this topic of sustainability and climate change. I mean, he's held a number of senior executive positions in academia, government, as well as business. And he got to know both the research side of things as well as the commercial and policy side of the sustainability and climate change debate. So I would like to welcome my students. Most of them are enrolled in my climate change economics and policy class, but there are also students from several other classes, as well as some of my colleagues at the La Trobe Business School. So welcome to all. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jan Libich. And while being an economist, I've had an active interest in this area of sustainability and climate change for over 2 decades. And I'm currently working on a related project that's funded by the Czech and Polish research councils. So thank you for the funding. Anyway, today we will proceed in a kind of Q&A style. It'll be an interview type of style to make the talk more dynamic. And I will have the privilege of asking Chris some questions for about 45 minutes, and then we'll give you an opportunity for maybe 5 minutes or so to also ask questions. So please, throughout the talk, write down if you have any thoughts, any areas that you would like Chris to kind of explore a little bit more. Please ask at the end. So without further ado, Chris, if you were offered 2 or 3 minutes by a major TV network to summarize the issue of climate change to a broad audience who may not know much about this. Now, obviously, that's not the case with our audience, but anyway, if you were to give a kind of summary of the topic, what would you say?
Well, I try and get about 4 or 5 points across. The first thing I try and communicate was it really is a serious issue. It's not a folder roll of scientists. It's not something that's made up. It really is quite a serious issue. And as a result of its seriousness, it's something that needs to be addressed. Now, because I've got a long-term perspective, I can also say it needs to be addressed somewhat urgently because we've been working on it for 40 years or so. Progress for work on it slow. And in fact, the climate is changing possibly more rapidly and more seriously than we might have expected 20 or 30 years ago. I think the fourth point I'd make is that it needn't cost the earth to do it. There are technologies available that are underway at the moment that mean you can make these structural changes without really significantly damaging economies or societies. And the fifth point I'd be making is that really the big risk is doing nothing. Where we sit today, and from what we've seen, if you let climate change just happen willy-nilly, the chance is it will cause more damage, more harm, more problem than addressing it sensibly. So in the 2 or 3 minutes, they're the sort of 4 or 5 points I'd try and make. People have heard those messages before. It's not new. I guess, until we do start the change more, we'll just continue pressing that case.
Mm. Unfortunately, I have to agree about the urgency of the issue, and we'll touch on many of the points that you raised later today. But before proceeding, I'd like to mention that, we agree that we would try to make the talk very practical for the audience. So, with a very real world focus. So, we're not going to be discussing theories so much, but we'll be drawing primarily on your personal experience, from business and policy making in this area. And, you started on the research side. So you were, for example, like a chief executive officer at the Cooperative Research Center for Greenhouse Accounting. That was, more than 20 years ago, I believe. But then, you strive to have a greater impact. So you kind of moved closer to business and government policy. So, for example, you worked in the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. You served as the leader at CSIRO's Climate, Weather, and Ocean Prediction area. And, that would be my second question. So climate predictions. I mean, there's all this mystique about them, and they seem to have evolved enormously over time. So can you just uh, tell us a little bit about how they work?
Sure. They did evolve because when the scientists were trying to explain what might happen in the future, they didn't know how to communicate it because this was very new science. So they started talking about scenarios, and they used that word very carefully because they were trying to paint a picture of what might happen given certain assumptions. Now, as knowledge improved, as the communication strategies improved, they then realized that they could be more specific about what was likely to happen given a certain set of conditions. And so as we evolved, and I worked with the scientists who put these together at CSIRO, and they began to form what were then termed climate change projections. That's to project what would happen to the climate given a certain set of socioeconomic assumptions. Now, the people get very confused between weather and climate. A weather prediction is actually very accurate, 24, 48, 72 hours out. And they get tested every day. And they interestingly get evaluated by machines every day, according to quite an objective score. They're the most accurate predictions that are actually made anywhere, even though people don't want to believe that. Where the climate system operates on statistics and probability. The climate is the average state of the weather. And so you need to move into a different approach to understand it, and that becomes the more probabilistic world. And that's when most people get completely lost because most humans don't understand probability or statistics.
So, I mean, you just reminded me there of this joke, why God created economists to make weather forecasters look good. But anyway, so can we dig a little bit deeper about the prediction? So you have these massive models, kind of what goes in, and how are we evaluating them?
So let's go back to the step-by-step approach. The first thing that we need to understand is the atmosphere is changing because we're putting mainly fossil fuels and deforesting and doing agriculture broadly. Now that changes the atmosphere, but the thing is, if you want to know if that's the basis of the change, your starting projection needs to be some sort of estimate as to how much of this fossil fuel, how much of these greenhouse gases are going to go into the atmosphere in the future. And that's actually not a scientific question. That's actually fundamentally an economic question.
A policy question. Yeah.
A policy question, policy economic question. So actually the scientists rely on the information from policymakers, economists, etc., to do what are called emissions scenarios. And you get a whole bunch of these, depending on different beliefs. You then can calculate quite accurately how much carbon, how much greenhouse gas will be left in the atmosphere after those emissions have been produced. But that's a first step. And every one of these, of course, has error bounds or uncertainty bounds on it. The next thing that you need to do is understand how that will affect the climate system. And that's where the global climate models or the Earth system models come in. Because you can do a very simple calculation that says, okay, we're doubling of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from pre-industrial, you'll get between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees of warming overall. But the Earth is trying to redistribute that warming all the time. That's partly it tries to, and that how that redistributes the warming, how the atmosphere moves, produces what's called the general circulation. So that's the part where the science comes in, and you produce, as a result of these assumptions, a set of projections on how climate will change. And it's not only temperature, but it's also, very importantly, precipitation, rainfall, snowfall, etc. And many of the impacts that we are seeing come from changes in the distribution of rainfall, which are quite hard to project. But the other thing is, the averages affect the extremes. So as a result of changing the so-called average weather conditions, you move the overall distribution. So extreme events change their probability and intensity.
And there seems to be quite a lot of research indicating that the frequency and severity of these extreme weather events, such as floods and hurricanes and droughts, is going to be increasing as a consequence of climate change.
Oh, yes. Well, it's even more stunning than that, as we've now been able to observe certain heat waves, for example, certain widespread flood events. And because scientists are really quite clever, they've been able to say, well, what is the probability of that event occurring in the absence of climate change? And they can then come up with the figures that the chance of this event occurring in this way without climate change is about 1 in 10,000. You know, so you then have to invoke a lot of special pleading to explain away whatever heat wave or what phenomenon occurred just as a result of natural variability. I think the fires recently in Victoria were a case of that. Very difficult to explain as part of what was previously seen as sort of a normal climatic event.
So if you were to compare the costs of climate action to the cost of doing nothing, because there's obviously climate denialists who argue that climate change is a hoax, and there might be some who say, well, it's happening, but we'd have to basically give up our way of life to do something about it. So would you be able to compare the cost of actually climate mitigation adaptation vis-a-vis the cost of basically climate change occurring?
I've got views. You're the economist that is actually fundamentally an economics question. But I think what we have seen in experienced for a number of years is there are a few points. Firstly, climate change is going to cost us regardless. If we do nothing about climate change, we will have to adapt at best, which incurs costs. I mean, if a huge set of bushfires strikes Australia, adaptation may be trying to make communities fire safe. It may be putting more money into emergency services. It may be hiring more psychological counsellors to deal with trauma, or as well as the straight out infrastructure costs. So the impacts are going to cost money, and adaptation costs money. And then on the other side, mitigation or adaptation is assumed to cost a lot of money. But what you're seeing from all of the experience and all the reports is the adaptation, the mitigation or abatement probably costs less than the damages. And people haven't been thinking very clearly, for example, about Australia's electricity infrastructure. I mean, a lot of our power stations were like the old axe. They'd had their handle replaced and their axe head replaced, and we were pretending that they were still the same sort of things. Australia was always going to have to pay a lot of money for replacing its coal-fired power stations. A lot of money in maintenance. Now, the question is, what do you replace them with? Now, with new technologies, it's going to be much cheaper to replace them with a variety of renewables, whether that be PV, wind, whatever, the various sorts of solar, etc. But there are people who still will not accept that argument. And my experience says the people who don't accept those arguments fall into sort of two categories. Those who are a bit like flat earthers, there are a lot of people who still argue and they genuinely believe the earth is flat. You're never going to persuade everybody all the time, and I just don't worry about them. But the other group of people or actors are those with a vested self-interest. And I think even 10 years ago, Frank Yotso made the comment, oh, there's been a bit of, argument around self-interest here, vested interests. And my experience has shown there's a lot of that somehow clouds the discussion.
Thank you. You mentioned Frank Yotso, who I interviewed more than 10 years ago here at La Trobe. And he happens to be one of the PhD candidates in one of the research centers that you founded, long time ago. And he ended up being one of the lead authors of the environmental panel on climate change. So my students kind of are aware of the video interview that we recorded in 2014. But before we get onto the business and policy, your personal experience. So okay, if we do nothing or if we do very little, as is commonly the case, currently the case, where does it lead us? I mean, in 2006, in the Stern Review, the mention was a 5 to 6 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures as a real possibility, and we seem to be potentially on track to that. So what are you what are you worried about?
I just don't think we can really imagine properly what the world will be like under those circumstances. It's very interesting. Luckily I've been in a situation of being able to go to Europe for the last 2 or 3 years, and consistently the European summer seems to have been hotter than people remembered the European summer being. Now, Europe's a good place to think about because unlike Australia, Europe has a pretty consistent climate. It has very clear seasonality in a way that Australia doesn't have. Very, very quickly you understand that spring turns to summer, goes to autumn, etc. But these people are experiencing temperatures in European cities that are beyond living memory. And we know that people are actually dying from those heat waves. But one of the discoveries in the climate change journey is not that people die of the cold. They actually die much more of heat shock and heat waves than they do of the cold. And that's a relatively minor kind of thing. I mean, I'm talking about people dying in Europe being a kind of a minor thing. It'd be very difficult for some cities to be inhabitable at these 5 to 6 degrees. I don't think we can imagine the cost of the severe storm events that are going to occur. We'd have to change our buildings for a start. So these costs just mount and mount and mount, and parts of the place that have been very comfortable to live in are going to suddenly be uncomfortable to live in. And I don't know where that leaves the vulnerable populations of the earth. And it's been well recognised for a long time that poorer, less developed societies are the ones likely to bear the brunt of the damages.
And I mean, you mentioned Europe, obviously, and that's a problem. But if you're thinking about other countries like, in the Middle East, I mean, they really will become uninhabitable. And, if you look at the numbers, it seems like compared to the pre-industrial times, so the second half of the, 19th century, the planet has warmed up by maybe 1.4 degrees Celsius. And, most of it actually occurred in the past 50 years.
Yes.
So that's also an issue that many of the denialists don't understand. And they're saying, oh, we've always had these, ups and downs, and we've had the ice age and so on. But, generally there was a warming of maybe 1 degree Celsius over 1,000 of years, not over 50 years. So there's like 20 times faster rate of warming. Is that the key problem? Why the planet cannot adjust to kind of the new circumstances?
Well, there are several things. You mentioned denialists. People get very confused about timescales. And you need to be really quite precise around the timescales you're talking about. I mean, we used to talk to glaciologists. Oh, they'd say we can see a catastrophic collapse of the Greenland ice shelf. And it's happening faster than we could ever imagine. And, okay, fine. Tell me, when we're going to see that? Oh, in the next 1,000 years, right? So a glaciologist talks and thinks about timescales quite differently from a geologist, from an ecologist, etc. So you need to be aware of timescales. What we have seen very large changes in global temperatures previously through geology. This change that we are witnessing now is extremely fast on geological timeframes, extremely fast. Has happened before this quickly, but one of the key things about these changes is human societies adapted through a period called the Holocene, the last 10,000, 20,000 years. And that has been a very quiescent, a very stable period of climate. So, the planet Earth will manage to get through whatever people inflict on the planet. The question really is, what happens to people? Do we drive the planet to an environment that becomes either much less inhabitable or pretty well uninhabitable for us. Or if it's inhabitable, maybe we can't actually run our society the way we're used to because it's outside the bounds for which we've adapted our societies and economies.
Now let's move on to the policy side, and I set an assignment for my climate change economics and policy students. Basically, I asked them if they were elected the Prime Minister of Australia and required to suggest 3 policies that they would implement in relation to climate change. So what would your selection be? Or maybe just pick one and, discuss why you would implement that policy.
I was very influenced by economists early on. And the economists at the time were saying that the most efficient way of really addressing emission reductions is via some sort of carbon trading or emissions trading scheme. I actually, the evidence to me still sees that as a very good way to go, but I would caveat that by saying I'd have really, really quite tough, despite whichever design of the emissions trading scheme, I'd have very, very tough limits and caps on it. And I'd try and drive those forward relatively aggressively as a major. Now, I know it's failed before. It's very ideal. And you said, oh, yeah, let's be practical. I don't think anybody from a practical perspective is going to do that in Australia. But you asked me the question what I'd try and do, and probably be that I'd be probably thrown out as the Prime Minister, like some people have been, and be sulking on the backbench. The other thing that I would be doing, though, is putting really looking hard at the adaptive side. As I said, that's inevitable. It's already happening. And I'd be really trying to put a lot of time and attention into trying to encourage our community to be more robust, encouraging emergency services, participation in emergency services, better building design, etc.
You mentioned the price of carbon, which is kind of established within an emissions trading scheme, and generally it's been maybe in Europe kind of around 60 euro mark per ton of emissions. There's a recent study kind of that is trying to calculate the true cost of carbon emissions, and taking into account all the costs of extreme weather events and so on that you talked about, and the price was in the order of $1,000 or euros per ton. So we really are nowhere near what we probably should be. But let me ask you about this policy that has not really been talked about much, but it's been suggested by Bruce Chapman, the professor at ANU, who's been looking at, who's one of the pioneers and the designer of the Australian HECS system, which is for financing university education. And he's been very instrumental in arguing that we can use the same idea for climate action. So we can, give people essentially loans for, installing solar panels, for drought relief, these sort of things. And if the firms or the individuals kind of reach a certain level of income or revenue, they pay back to the society. If they don't, then they never have to pay back. So it's kind of something between a normal subsidy and a loan, in a way that kind of can be extended to more people. Do you think that that's potentially a good idea in the climate arena?
Actually, I do. I said to you that I think anything is worth a go, but I guess I'd make another point, and that is from the business side, getting investment into the right areas, and by the right areas I mean areas that really reduce emissions or facilitate emissions reduction or something like that, is extremely difficult. One of the reasons why I went to CO2 Australia is I looked at the Australian Stock Exchange, the ASX, the Securities Exchange, and at the time there was a sustainability index, right? And the sustainability index ended up being made of, I don't know, maybe a dozen companies. Sims Metal at the time was one, which does recycling and removal of rubbish. And I began thinking about it and thought that the trouble you've got with something like the ASX, if you've only got that much of the board that is positive towards the environment, it means that 99.5% of the investment that we make is either neutral or harmful to the environment. And that's a fundamental problem. Because if we continue to invest in things that are not sustainable, we're only going to continue to get non-sustainable outcomes. So that's a heroic challenge, is finding pathways that enable investment into companies that can genuinely be sustainable. We've never got nowhere near it. No, I've tried and failed a couple of times. It's really quite tough. And so at the individual level, something like the green loans, which is what's being suggested, is a great idea. But how you do that institutionally, I don't have an answer, but I think it's one of the most potent things. So if any of the students there can figure out ways in their careers of creating investment vehicles that are real, that are more attractive because they're sustainable than competing investments that are not sustainable, that's a real winner.
Well, the question here, whether there's a role for the government to play. I mean, normally we think of the involvement of government in climate action as, either bans or, subsidies or maybe some kind of incentive schemes. But what about things like, having some state-owned enterprises that are kind of, doing public-private partnerships. So, the government kind of getting involved through this kind of avenues.
It's interesting, Jan. I just think in Australia, we're culturally unable to swallow that. Right? We've all got to deal with the culture that we're embedded in. The part that surprises me more is our governments haven't even been able to do what the Obama government did, is find ways of investing in companies at a 20, 30, 40% equity level to provide some stability, for example, or whatever it may be. We're seeing that in aviation. So as a policy approach, it's interesting that no one talks about equity, and maybe rather than having a fully state-owned enterprise, which can be successful, but you don't consider more novel approaches. It's interesting, we just don't, it's just considered off the table. I think there is a role for state-owned enterprises personally in certain things when there's deep market failure and it's in community interest. Identifying those cases, of course, is always interesting.
Well, you mentioned the politics. I think in the US, it would be even more striking, on the Republican side of the spectrum. If there's a talk of government, you immediately labeled a communist. So I think the debate is even more extreme there. But can I just ask you? I mean, you've been to these kind of policy platforms, these COPs meeting. Can you tell us a little bit about those? I mean, I think all of us kind of wonder how it's all going. The behind the scenes kind of negotiations in these conference of the parties.
I haven't been for a long time, but even then they were quite some circuit. So I have up to say 30,000 people in the hallways. And the thing is, alongside, as part of the whole process, they created what were called side events. And these side events became almost like a bazaar, a showcase, a kind of marketplace where you had an infinite number of lobby groups stand up and present something or other, whether it be somebody concerned about coral reefs bleaching or the aluminium industry trying to explain they were really good people after all and not to worry about emissions, whatever. So about a large number of people never really participated all in the negotiations, but they're there as the event to try and influence policymakers and lobby. Then you've got professional lobbyists trying to talk to delegates. At the time, Australia was sending a delegation of around 30. Right now, in that 30, you'd have industry lobbyists who were there given accreditation to be on that to sort of check that the government was doing what it was saying it was doing. And then you had the core part of the delegation, which were all essentially bureaucrats, but you'd have the specialists on the GF or the specialists on Article 3.8.9 or 2.89. And they would just follow that particular part of the negotiation, because the negotiations have these set piece plenary pieces where the ministers get up and say, oh, Australia's doing this and we're fabulous. And China says, we're doing this and Australia's terrible, but we're great, whatever. And they're the set piece. And then you've got these contentious parts that get broken up into the side meetings. And some of the side meetings are open and some of them are closed. And so you can, you have the side negotiations. And the closed one obviously is where all the real meat is occurring. And, you've then got a whole lot of agreed texts or all the little bits that they've got to do. And then the last crunch of it is you've got to crunch this down into a single agreed text. And, the United Nations is amazing because it's the only organization that can enable time to stop. Because in a few negotiations, it's got to stop midnight, Friday the 13th. And they get to 11:55 or 11:57 and they go, right, we're closing it. This time's going to stop. They stop the clock at 11:58. They lock all the delegates in and they continue to 3 or 4 in the morning until the final part of the text is agreed. And they come out very bleary and say, yes, we've reached an agreement, or this is the final communique. So it's quite a weird kind of place, really.
Now, I mean, we talked quite a bit about the policy, and I understand why it's hard for 30,000 people to reach some kind of conclusion, which is probably why we haven't really seen any action in combination with the fact that there's this massive negative externality and a free rider problem, globally across countries. Everybody wants the others to do their bit, but not to have to spend the money to do the investment themselves. But let's move on to the interesting part in your business kind of journey. So you were director at Sea Farms, and you were kind of instrumental behind the Sea Dragon project, which is about sustainable aquaculture. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it was a challenge said to me about how do we grow more protein in Australia. That was a challenge that was given to me by somebody, and I began to look at it because there are a few things about food. I know that people, particularly in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, are quite keen to be vegan. And they often do that for moral or ideological reasons. But if you look at the data, it turns out that humans biologically are omnivores. And trying to get large numbers of humans not to eat meat is not very practical. You may try, it doesn't work. You're going to have to feed this market. The second part of it is the world's oceans are under enormous pressure. They're kind of a little bit out of sight, out of mind, but they're really under enormous. They're under pressure because of fishing. And we're taking huge amounts of fish out of the global oceans. They're under pressure because of pollution, etc. So I figured that seafood is a core part of human diets in a lot of places. And if Australia could make a contribution to that via farming seafood, that may be beneficial. And then we began to look for places where that could be done feasibly. So that's the sustainability part of it. And if you manage the local environment properly and you don't exceed the carrying capacity of that environment, it can be sustainable.
And so I understand that the uniqueness of the project was that it was kind of all vertically integrated. So you had everything kind of under not one roof, but everything kind of together. So how did that work, or what was the plan?
The plan is, see, that it's like a value chain, and you're seeing this happening anyway in various places. But you've got to take prawns essentially from a hatchling stage in a hatchery. So you mate the prawns in a hatchery, and you grow them up through the various life cycle stages, and then you release them into larger ponds. And typically, what had happened was that specialist hatchery companies around the world established, and they would sell the Norplii to the grow out people, and the grow out people would then grow the prawns to market size and then sell them on to Nisui, whoever it was to do that. So our aim was to integrate all those steps in the value chain.
And that was including the breeding that kind of comes at the very start of the process.
Yeah, well, we took a leaf out of the poultry industry, because the poultry industry now, I can't remember the numbers, but it only takes a few weeks to grow a chicken from egg to saleable, whereas previously it was a matter of months. And that rapid change in growth is all due to genetic breeding enhancement. I mean, the amount of breeding that goes into our food system would astonish most people.
Now, can you just tell us something what happened with the
I think
project?
Yeah, it fell apart. Look, we got all the approvals. I personally negotiated an Indigenous land use agreement, and I think, looking back, the first real blow was actually COVID. Strangely enough, we were very close to getting financed on that project, and when COVID hit around the world, all financiers they were very, very open about it. They said, "Oh, we're putting our pencils down. We're not going to make any. We don't even understand what this means for our books. We're not going to do anything for 6 months or so." And then trying to get this project up when people actually couldn't move around the country, they couldn't meet, etc., became difficult. And then I left, and somebody just took a different view.
And there was a multi-billion-dollar kind of budget, and there's still articles everywhere on the web kind of celebrating it and kind of.
Yeah, the other thing though is there was a commercial dispute between the people we contracted to do it, and the quality of work and all that sort of stuff. So there's another couple of court actions that I haven't been involved in.
Interesting. So, I mean, maybe we're running out of time. We have 5 more minutes before we pass the mic to the audience, so to speak. But over that 30+ year journey that you've been in this sustainability climate change arena, if you had to think about some big surprises that you've experienced, something that really you wouldn't expect looking forward 30 years ago.
There are two. I mean, I am surprised. We were surprised. I think because I came from a science background, I think others who I work with were surprised that we're surprised at the pushback against the science that occurred. We thought that if you explain the science to people, we didn't expect to get involved in a debate for 15 years about whether the science was reasonable or not. I mean, I think that really surprised everyone. And the experience then tells you, well, it's the old quote attributed to a former Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, the horse called morality often merely makes it through the post, but the nag named self-interest always runs a good race. And that's real. I mean, I think a number of us thought we were quite naive. I think the other big surprises was Australian politics. I mean, I left CSIRO and the Bureau just at the point where both parties had agreed there ought to be an emissions trading scheme. So we didn't think there was any difference in the policy positions. That we thought that the legislation had gone through, and then a new Prime Minister came in over one night and completely wiped the whole lot. And I think those sudden political shocks were because they can't really be predicted with other big surprises.
And just quickly, in terms of the current government, I mean, there was some promise. I think a lot of people, it was a bit of a green wave in the last election in Australia, and people were kind of hopeful that there'll be more climate action happening. So how would you assess the actions that they've implemented so far? Are they on the right track, or are they kind of falling behind their promises?
I think Australia's just a bit stuck generally, really, on this issue. So, and I wouldn't, if I knew how to unstick it, I would. I think the government's probably, well, I think the commentators are probably right. The government's at a position where it actually doesn't want to be too bold. It's trying to keep faith with a whole lot of different parties. And I think they find that very, very difficult at present. So people want more to be done. Look, I think there's some good news. What we are seeing, and I saw an article from the ABC the other day, is emissions in a lot of places are beginning to trend down. And out today, Britain closed down the last power station. They were the first country to have an electric power station, and they've the first one to close all of them down. I always hope that technology and the combination technology and economics would actually drive this, and the market would end up driving it much more quickly and leave the politicians behind. I actually think that's happening. And with sustainable development, they do talk about the technology being available, and we are seeing there are a few technology gaps that are important. We don't see certain technologies that we need, but these big advances, particularly in PV, are very, very hopeful. And I think PV is on what's called Moore's law. So it'll just keep on reducing in cost and doubling in efficiency very quickly.
Lovely, really interesting insights. So we've gone for about 45 minutes now. So I'd like to open it up to students and my colleagues to ask questions and hear some of your interesting views. So if you can please unmute yourself. You don't have to put the video on. You can just unmute yourselves and ask a question. Anybody? I have plenty of further questions to ask, but I was hoping to kind of diversify.
Yeah, I'll ask a question.
Okay, thank you, James.
Hey, Chris. It's cool to hear we are trying for more sustainable in ways of growing crops. And I was wondering if you are working on any other projects.
No, I've finished work. Just do this because it's enjoyable to speak to the bright students of the future. My job now, if I had any job at all, it'd be trying to stimulate people like you to come up with novel and creative and doable ideas to do that.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Next question. Anybody would like to ask anything? So maybe while you're thinking about questions, I might ask about the upcoming US presidential election, because it seems like when the Republican candidate has signaled that he would again stop any kind of climate action in the US, and it's been believed that because of existence of various tipping points in climate change, that could be, electing him could be a decision that would be felt, for millions of years, unlike some of the other potentially negative consequences that we can recover from. It seems like, this one would be very hard to recover from. What's your view on this and more generally about tipping points and climate change?
Okay, so tipping. I tend to want to be more optimistic than go for tipping points. But there are things I always think of that actually also in a slightly different way as reversibility. Okay, so we know, for example, that extinctions with biodiversity are irreversible. You can't, people would like to bring back all sorts of animals that have gone extinct. So that's a kind of change that's irreversible. So I think that's a more useful concept than a tipping point. The other thing about the other idea of a tipping point comes from chaos theory, where you go from one system state across into another system state that's actually quite different. It is possible that you hit some change or discontinuity that does mean that we end up with quite a different world, and then in which case you would have a trajectory of change that could last hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. Obviously, you hope that doesn't happen. But there are surprises. there are such things as climate surprises, so you can't rule it out.
Mm. There's a question in the chat from a student. Thank you, Jess. Hi, Chris. What are your thoughts on the reduction of consumption of red meats, beef specifically, in order to combat climate change?
I think it's highly scientifically valid as a strategy, because we know that the cows eat cattle, big methane producers at, you know, whatever it is, 21 global warming potential, 21, 24 or whatever. However, I'm a terrible meat eater. You know, try and get me off my meat is a really tough thing. So although it's a very legitimate, viable strategy, I go back to the other point. You've got, you know, humans are not always rational, and you've got this recalcitrant part of them. So that you know, I wouldn't want to bet on that strategy as being a winner, because I think trying to persuade everyone that that's the way to go is going to be pretty tough. If you were to take that as a personal action, I think it's fantastic, but I don't necessarily believe it'll win as the major strategy.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, there's a Long Hao.
There's another one from
Long Hao Wang. So climate change is having an increasingly significant impact on Australian agriculture. How are farmers adapting to these climate changes, and what support is being provided by the government? That's a great question.
Oh, good. I don't know about modern government programs. One of the major ways that the government supports agriculture and food production in Australia is via the R&D system, where the farmers are effectively taxed by an R&D corporation, but the government slings in $1 for every dollar, and farmers have found that extremely useful. There are all sorts of adaptations taking place. There are wine companies, for example, that have relocated. So there's one, Brown Brothers as an example, that's brought up in Tasmania because they know that the kind of cool climate wines that they market and the consumer likes are going to be better made in Tasmania into the future. So they've invested heavily there. There's been a large amount of research going into drought tolerant varieties of wheat, for example, that can do much less. The other major change that's occurring in Australian agriculture, particularly in horticulture, is a bit what Europe's done, which has tended to go into more glass house. So they're trying to have sort of what they call climate protected agriculture. So they're moving it into glass houses, structures where the damage isn't as great. And the other thing that's occurred is that they've been very good at using the entire geography of Australia. So as agriculture is corporatised, they've kind of been able to hedge their climate bets. So they'll have farms perhaps in Victoria, but all the way up the eastern coast. What that's enabled them to do is supply the markets throughout the season for more consistency, and they've been able to drive that into a supermarket chain. So, you know, just one example of something that a product is, say, blueberries. Blueberries were highly seasonal once. Now there's a crisis when they're not on the shelf for 2 months of the year because they're out of season.
I would perhaps add to your list the kind of comeback of industrial hemp, which is a very kind of environmentally friendly crop, and it's been taking off in Europe and parts of the US and also in Australia. But again, there's need for government support to kind of get it off the ground and have all the pieces of the supply chain happening. But some of my colleagues here are doing research on this, and it looks very promising.
Oh, that's right. So that goes into the larger category of essentially product diversification as the other adaptive strategy.
Right, excellent. Another question from the audience, either in the chat or you unmute yourself.
Yeah, you mentioned that humans aren't rational, and yet when you study economics, we kind of tend to have this opinion that, you know, we study these neoclassical economic models which assume rationality from people like the Friedmans, and across the world, like, you've got more government intervention happening, particularly with, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, and we've got the Future Made in Australia Act. And when you mentioned that the market might correct, do you think the market can correct without that government intervention, or do you think that's a necessary part of it?
I think government intervention is helpful, but markets do. I'm not an economist, and I was sort of taught markets are at equilibrium. I don't think markets are at equilibrium. I think they strive for equilibrium. I think that's more of the point. They're trying to reach equilibrium, and there's always some shock or something happens that means that they're not quite there. But they do tend to try and fix themselves over time. It's whether or not the governments can't actually give a helping and useful hand. The hard part, I think, is the ethics. You know, I mean, there's an ethical component that we don't talk about much in Australia, and I think hopefully governments are able to assist with a view as to what society would be like in its better moments.
Mm. Well, I would just add to this as an economist that, the problem is that markets can't really, fix that negative externality. There's got to be some regulation that kind of comes in either through, a carbon tax or something that will, when people start to incorporate that into their decision making. But when you mentioned the issue of equity, it seems it's, within a country as well as internationally. So one of the questions is, should high income countries that have much higher, greenhouse gas emissions per capita, and have, used that to develop, to reach a higher level of development, should they kind of contribute a greater share towards solving the climate crisis than, low-income countries?
I actually think in the end that's been accepted that they should, and that's what the Global Environment Facility is fundamentally about, and that's what the structure of the Framework Convention on Climate Change is about, with the Annex 1 construct. So I think it's accepted that they should, and that goes again back to sustainable development. If you look at that original 1984 definition of sustainable development, it does talk about equity. But of course, the devil's always in the detail. How much should they? And I think one of the flaws in the thinking is that actually you wouldn't want to repeat the past trajectory of development if you had a choice today. You'd actually want to have the opportunity for a path of development for the 21st century, not the 20th century. A good example of that, a good example is telecommunications in India. They never really ended up having a massive fixed line network for telephones, and most Indians didn't have televisions. They actually went straight to mobile phones pretty well. You wouldn't want to make them have to have a fixed line network for the whole of India before they were allowed to get mobile phones.
That's a good example. There's another question by Gabriel in regards to solar energy. So what are your thoughts given, what are the inefficiencies and, their reduction over time? What do you think about them, kind of promoting them in Australia more strongly?
I think we should. Well, there's a whole lot of reasons. In my observation, Australia's often imported policy solutions to policy problems that we don't have. And we've often copied the US. So Australia is unlike the US in that we have an absolute abundance of primary energy. In fact, Australia's almost got too much primary energy. So we've got bucket loads of uranium. We had bucket loads of gas until we sold most of it overseas and then decided we needed some ourselves. We have one of the best solar resources anywhere on the planet. And we've also got really good wind resources. So put all that together, you would think that we would figure out that it was in our interests to really look at the opportunity that solar has. And there's a whole bunch of technologies. So we've got the biggest penetration of rooftop PV anywhere in the world. Now we don't quite know how to manage it. And that I think ought to continue because PV is going to become cheaper and cheaper. But also I think there's a very strong role for large scale solar of various sorts. Now, solar thermal hasn't quite made it. I don't understand really well. There'll be an economic reason for that. So clearly the other piece particularly for solar, or the two pieces are distribution networks, because the solar resource actually isn't where the coal mines are necessarily. And also what they call the firming the firming technologies, batteries or whatever, we're seeing a really big reduction in the cost of batteries. I don't know what pathway they're on, but I think solar represents a fantastic opportunity for Australia, along with energy conservation. And that includes having houses properly insulated, which people from Europe scratch their heads at Australian houses because they leak like sieves. But also big changes in lighting technology. LEDs made a huge change already. So there's a lot of optimism, but yes, let's figure out ways of pursuing it. And again, coming back to your point, Jan, my observation is government subsidies and support are necessary for the very early stage introduction of technologies. You don't get them without that kind of decision. The real policy risk is weaning people off that government support because they get used to it.
That's absolutely right. So unfortunately, we're out of time. I mean, I think we could be sitting here and listening to your wisdom for much longer, but on behalf of La Trobe students, as well as the global community, I can say, I'd like to thank you for your interesting insights today, as well as for your immense contribution in this area of sustainability and climate change over the past 3 decades. And I really hope that we'll be able to make progress and avert a climate disaster and saving the planet in a good shape for future generations. So thank you very, very much, and hopefully, let's hope for the best.
Thanks, Jan. I just want to say one thing. I don't think of it about saving the planet. In my mind, the planet will look after itself. It's all about saving ourselves.
That's true. Very, very true. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for participating. Thank you guys for your questions. And I really look forward to seeing you again in the future in some of my classes. Thank you.
Thanks very much.